"You're just waiting to die, old man." Those were the words my son's wife screamed at me that night. The way her voice shook the kitchen walls felt colder than the winter wind sliding through the cracked window behind her. She stood there in her expensive red dress, arms crossed, chin lifted just enough to make sure I knew exactly how little she thought of me. My son didn't say a word. He stood beside her with his hands in his pockets, eyes wandering everywhere except toward mine. Silence can wound deeper than any insult, and he stabbed me with every second of it. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even sigh. I just looked at both of them the same way a father looks at children who don't realize they're playing with fire they cannot control. My chest felt tight, not because of her insult, but because I could barely recognize the man standing next to her anymore. My son used to defend me when he was young. He used to tell kids in the neighborhood that I was his hero. Now he couldn't even defend me in his own house. She kept talking, her voice sharp, fast, and dripping with disgust. She said I was a burden. She said I moved too slowly, ate too much, took up space in their home. She said I should start thinking about nursing homes before someone pushes you into one. She was smiling when she said that part. A cold, polished smile that showed too much pride and not enough soul. My son finally murmured something like, "Maybe we all need space," but the way he said it, avoiding my eyes, felt like a blade slipping between ribs. It wasn't the words. It was the disappointment behind them. Not disappointment in me, no. Disappointment that I was still there. Disappointment that I didn't disappear on my own to make their life easier. I could feel the heaviness in the room, pressing on my back as I walked toward the hallway. I didn't slam doors, didn't stomp, didn't react. That would have given them too much. I simply retreated to the small guest room they allowed me to stay in. The air felt stale, as if the walls themselves knew I didn't belong there anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands that once built his treehouse, fixed his bike, held him when he cried over scraped knees and broken hearts. Those same hands were now treated like they were nothing. I lay awake long after the shouting died down. My son's wife laughed a few times in the living room, sharp, victorious laughs that made my stomach twist. I heard my son say he was tired and wanted to sleep. I heard her call him weak. I heard him let her. The house I once helped him buy, the house I had paid deposits for, had turned into a place where my presence was treated like a curse. But life has a strange way of reminding people where their strength really comes from. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat upright, thinking. Not about revenge. Not about hurting them. But about respect, how it's given, how it's taken, how it's earned, and how easily it can be forgotten. They thought I was powerless. They thought age made me irrelevant. They thought disrespect had no price. They were wrong. When the sky finally shifted from black to gray, I stood up and stretched. A quiet calm washed over me, the kind of calm that settles when a decision has already been made deep inside your bones. I put on my coat, grabbed my phone, and stepped outside before either of them woke. The morning air tasted cleaner than it had in months. I made one call. Just one. A simple call that took less than a minute. A call that required no threats, no raised tone, no explanations. A call to a world my son's wife had no idea I was connected to. A world she assumed old men could never touch. A world where I still had influence, respect, and authority far more than she or my son ever imagined. By the time I returned home, the sun was rising. Light spilled across the front of the house, warming everything except the coldness sitting inside those walls. I felt no anger as I closed the front door behind me. What I felt was clarity, icy, steady clarity, because I knew what would happen next. I knew that sometime soon, maybe in minutes, maybe in an hour, she would reach into her purse, pull out her shiny wallet, and try to use one of her cards. And I knew exactly what would happen, and when it did, her scream would echo through the entire house, because the moment she tried to spend a single dollar, her bank cards would already be blocked. And that was only the beginning. The morning had barely begun when the first signs of chaos appeared. My son's wife rushed into the kitchen, fumbling with her wallet, her hands shaking so violently that she almost dropped it on the marble counter. The first card she pulled refused to work. Her brows furrowed, confusion painting her face like a storm cloud. She tried the second, then the third, all met with the same denial. Her eyes widened in panic as her fingers flew over the keypad again and again. What is happening?" she screamed, a mix of disbelief and fury rising in her voice. My son entered the kitchen, still groggy from sleep, rubbing his eyes. He frowned at her frantic movements. "Honey, calm down. It must be a mistake," he muttered, trying to sound reassuring, though his voice carried an unmistakable tremor. "Calm down." If only he knew how calm I had remained the night before while plotting this quiet, precise reckoning. I remained in the hallway, observing. My posture was relaxed, my face serene, my hands clasped behind my back. I didn't need to intervene. Every frantic movement, every failed attempt at control, every tremor of panic was a lesson unfolding perfectly before me. Their arrogance had always been their shield, but now that shield had cracked, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. She screamed again, this time louder, slamming her wallet onto the counter. "No, this can't be happening. My cards, all of them." The sound of her panic echoed through the house, ricocheting off walls that had once witnessed her arrogance and entitlement. My son froze mid-step, staring at the counter, realization slowly dawning. The shock on his face mirrored the horror in hers, though he tried to maintain a semblance of composure. His lips parted, but no words came. I stepped into the kitchen then, casually, almost lazily. "It seems there's been a small inconvenience," I said softly, letting the weight of my voice fill the space. My calmness contrasted sharply with their panic, making the air thicker, more oppressive. She whipped around to face me, eyes blazing with disbelief and indignation. "Dad!" "What did you?" she started, but I let my calm smile silence her before she could finish. "Sometimes," I said quietly, "people forget that there's a world beyond what they can see. A world where actions have consequences, where respect matters more than arrogance, and where patience outweighs fury." My son looked at me, his posture shrinking slightly, a hint of guilt beginning to etch itself into his features. She tried again to swipe a card, but the machine refused. Her fingers trembled violently. "This isn't fair. This is impossible," she yelled, and her voice cracked, revealing panic she had never experienced before. It was the first real crack in the wall of superiority she had built around herself. Her confidence, the very thing she wielded like a weapon, evaporated in front of me. I let her panic simmer for a few moments longer, watching closely. Every gesture, every exclamation, every frantic attempt to regain control was a reminder of their recklessness, of their arrogance, of their failure to respect someone who had spent decades building not only a life but a network, a sphere of influence, a quiet authority they never imagined existed. Finally, my son stepped forward, a weak attempt to regain control, placing a hand on her shoulder. Okay, we'll call the bank. It must be a technical error," he muttered, voice low, eyes darting nervously toward me. I nodded slightly, as if to approve, though approval was not what I offered. It was observation, the kind that leaves no room for denial. She looked at me, now trembling, her ego shattered. "Dad, what did you do?" Her voice was almost a whisper, thick with fear and incredulity. I didn't answer. The envelope from last night had been the first warning, the silent prelude. Blocking the cards was the first strike in a sequence she could not see but would feel completely. I only smiled faintly, letting the quiet authority of decades carry the lesson she had so long ignored. By midday, the house had transformed. Panic replaced arrogance. Fear replaced pride. And through it all, I remained calm, an unshakable figure in a storm of their own making. My son and his wife now understood, without me lifting a hand in anger, without me raising my voice, without a single outburst, the power of preparation, patience, and quiet authority. Later, as I watched them from the doorway while they frantically called the bank, I realized something. True strength doesn't roar. True strength waits. True strength teaches lessons quietly and then lets the consequences speak for themselves. And today, the consequences were screaming louder than either of them ever could. By evening, the fear had settled into a tense respect, or at least a tentative recognition of power they had dismissed for too long. I stood near the window, the golden light of sunset illuminating my short gray hair, my calm eyes, my warm, authoritative presence. I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes not from revenge, but from justice. Justice meted out with precision, patience, and dignity. This was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more lessons. And by then, my son and his wife would begin to understand that underestimating a father with experience, patience, and quiet influence can be the gravest mistake of their lives. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was suffocating. You could almost feel the panic dripping from every corner, pooling in the living room like a storm ready to break. My son's wife paced back and forth, phone clutched tightly in one hand, trying desperately to get someone at the bank on the line. Her voice, once filled with arrogance, now trembled with urgency. "This can't be real. It can't be," she exclaimed, every word punctuated by frustration and fear. My son stood behind her, rubbing his temples, his usual bravado completely stripped away. I watched quietly from the hallway, my posture relaxed, my gaze calm. Every movement they made told a story of entitlement, of disrespect, of realization slowly dawning, and I observed it all with quiet satisfaction. This was the culmination of years of watching, waiting, and knowing exactly when to act. She tried card after card, each one failing to work. Her fingers flew over the keypad with desperation, and I could see the frustration building, boiling over into panic. Her confident, condescending smile from the night before had vanished entirely, replaced by the raw vulnerability of someone who suddenly realized they were powerless. My son's attempts to calm her did nothing. He couldn't fix what had already been set in motion. I walked into the kitchen then, each step deliberate, measured. The sunlight spilling through the windows caught the edges of the envelope I still held in my hand. She froze mid-motion as our eyes met, her jaw tightening. My calm presence alone seemed to weigh the air down, heavier than any argument, more binding than any insult. "Everything is fine," I said softly, letting the words hang in the room like an unspoken warning. Her panic escalated. She tried to shout, to demand explanations, but no sound came out the way she intended. Every scream that left her mouth sounded brittle, fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. Her face was pale, eyes wide, and she bit her lip to stop herself from crying. My son's face mirrored her fear. The arrogance that had defined him moments ago replaced by shame, disbelief, and a dawning understanding of the power he had ignored. I moved closer to the table, placing my hand gently on the envelope. The weight of it was symbolic, though she didn't yet understand. "You see," I said quietly, "people often mistake visibility for power. They think that noise, threats, and arrogance make them untouchable. But life has its own way of teaching lessons, usually quietly, sometimes painfully." My son swallowed hard. The words sank in, though he tried to mask the effect, trying to appear unaffected. But the trembling of his hands betrayed him. She dropped the wallet onto the counter, her fingers shaking violently. "Dad, what did you?" She stammered, barely forming words through the shock. I let silence answer for me. It was more powerful than any statement. She leaned over the counter, eyes scanning the contents of the envelope, a collection of legal documents, records, and financial notifications. Her pale face turned even whiter as comprehension struck. She had been outmaneuvered, caught completely unprepared by a man she thought was fragile and powerless. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows through the kitchen as I continued to watch. My son sank into a chair, hands over his face, as if trying to hide from the lesson unfolding before him. The woman next to him, trembling, tried again to call the bank, only to hear the same rejection each time. Her confidence, her sense of control, evaporated entirely. For the first time, they understood the consequences of disrespecting someone who had spent decades quietly accumulating wisdom, patience, and authority. I stood near the counter, my expression calm, almost serene. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to force them into compliance. Every failure of theirs, every moment of panic, every second of shame was teaching them more than any lecture ever could. They were finally seeing the truth, that true power doesn't come from shouting, from intimidation, or from wealth. True power comes from patience, planning, and knowing when to act. Hours passed. They sat in stunned silence, occasionally glancing at me as if expecting another trick. But I gave them nothing. I simply observed, letting the lesson settle into their bones. My son's wife finally slumped against the counter, exhausted, defeated, her energy sapped by fear and realization. My son leaned back in his chair, shoulders heavy, eyes downcast, no words left to defend his pride. By late afternoon, the tension in the house was palpable but quieter now. Their panic had turned into shame. Their arrogance had dissolved into reflection. They were forced to confront a truth they had ignored for far too long. Respect cannot be demanded. And disrespect carries consequences they could not have imagined. I moved to the window, looking out at the garden as the sun began its slow descent, golden light spilling across the floor. I felt a calm satisfaction that had nothing to do with anger or revenge. What I felt was balance restored, a lesson delivered, pride humbled, and a family reminded of the value of humility and patience. Tomorrow, the final act would unfold. And when it did, they would understand fully that one quiet, calm man, standing firm in his dignity and experience, could change the course of lives without raising a hand, without shouting a single word, because sometimes the quietest actions speak the loudest. And they were about to hear the loudest lesson of all. The morning arrived with a tense silence in the house. My son's wife had barely slept, her face pale and drawn, eyes red-rimmed from a night of panic and sleepless worry. My son moved around the kitchen silently, trying to avoid her gaze, but the weight of yesterday's lessons hung over him like a storm cloud. I watched from the doorway, calm and composed, feeling the quiet satisfaction that comes when a plan unfolds exactly as it should. She tried again to use her cards, hands trembling violently as she swiped and typed, only to be met with the same rejection every single time. Her panic turned to desperation, her frantic motions scattering papers and receipts across the counter. "This is insane. There has to be a mistake," she screamed, voice cracking with anger and disbelief. My son stood behind her, eyes wide, realizing there was no mistake, no technical error, no way to salvage their pride. The lesson I had set in motion was complete, irreversible. I stepped forward then, moving slowly, deliberately. "It seems," I said, voice calm and low, "that the world is reminding us that respect is earned, not assumed. That arrogance can crumble faster than the strongest walls. And that underestimating someone who has spent a lifetime quietly building knowledge, patience, and influence is a very costly mistake." My words hung in the air, and both of them froze, staring at me as if they were seeing me for the first time in years. She dropped the wallet, and her hands shook uncontrollably. "Dad, what did you?" she started, but I let the silence answer for her. There was no need to explain. She already understood, and the realization was devastating. My son's eyes darted between me and her, guilt and fear mingling on his face, his pride crumbling into dust. For the first time, he saw clearly the consequences of his disrespect, his entitlement, his blind arrogance. I moved closer, placing my hand lightly on the counter. Sometimes lessons don't need yelling, threats, or displays of power. They need clarity, precision, and timing. And sometimes, silence is the loudest teacher of all. The words sank in slowly. They were finally grasping the truth I had tried to impart for years. True authority comes not from domination, but from wisdom, patience, and the quiet confidence of experience. She sank into a chair, trembling, exhausted, humiliated. Her aura of superiority had evaporated completely, leaving only a raw vulnerability that was both uncomfortable and illuminating. My son slouched beside her, shoulders heavy, face pale, swallowing the bitter reality that his arrogance had not only failed to protect him, but had led him straight into this humbling reckoning. By late afternoon, the house had transformed from a scene of conflict to one of reflection. The frantic energy, the shouting, the entitlement, they had all dissolved into stunned silence. The lesson had been delivered. No words, no arguments, no dramatics were needed. The consequences themselves had spoken, and they were loud enough for both of them to hear. I stood by the window, sunlight spilling across my gray hair and calm face, watching the golden light fill the room. The peace in my own heart was absolute. This was not about revenge. It was about justice, about balance, about showing, quietly and decisively, that disrespect has a price, that arrogance carries consequences, and that the wisdom of years cannot be dismissed by impatience or entitlement. Finally, I walked through the house, calmly observing them. My presence alone reminded them of the lesson they had learned. Patience, planning, and quiet authority are far more powerful than any rage-fueled confrontation. They could feel the weight of it, understand it in their bones, and know that it would not be forgotten. When the day ended, I left the room for the last time, glancing back at the two figures sitting quietly, humbled and thoughtful. Their pride had been shattered, but understanding had begun to take root. And as I stepped outside into the warm evening light, I realized that sometimes the most powerful actions are the quietest. Sometimes, the strongest lessons are the ones delivered without anger, without haste, without noise, and in that moment, I knew they would never underestimate me, or the quiet strength of experience. Again. Because sometimes, silence is louder than a scream. And sometimes, the consequences speak for themselves.